Maybe 6 months ago, I innocently asked on Twitter if there's such a thing as a British way of war, and very quickly people responded very helpfully, and they said, oh, absolutely, read this book and read that book. Well, I read this book and that book, and sure enough, there is a British way of war, or rather, there's a vibrant debate about whether or not there is a British way of war. And the more I read, the more I thought this is really very interesting. Not only that, but the debate had lots of very, very interesting implications for today, both with respect to British defense policy, but more largely with respect to military strategy as a whole. So in this video, what I want to do is I want to explore the idea of a British way of war. I'm going to talk about the debate, and also happily I get to talk about two of my favorite British military theorists. The first is Julian Corbett, who's probably the finest British strategic thinker ever. He's really great. He should be required reading in any course about military strategy. He's really amazing. In addition to Corbett, we have Basil Liddell Hart, who has written extensively. He had a profound influence about not just British military thinking, but military thinking in general. For instance, I know that he had a major influence on my favorite French strategist, General Andre Boff. By the way, my name is Michael Shurkin, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be on my mind. So let's start with Corbett. Now, Corbett really is terrific. Corbett lived from 1854 to 1922, and he really, well, he's great. He's a naval historian. He also had a very important role to play in terms of British naval thinking, British maritime strategy. He was involved in the British government debates and British government policies, and he was really kind of an insider who helped shape the way a lot of British commanders and policymakers thought about strategy and thought about naval matters, etc. Corbett wrote a lot. If you were to read one book of Corbett, I highly recommend his book, Some Principles of Maritime Strategy, A Theory of War in the High Seas, Naval Warfare, and the Command of the Fleets, which he published in 1911. I put a link in the description to that book, as well as to another book if you really want to read a lot about this. This book is excellent. This is one of the books that people on Twitter said I should read, and then I went and read. By the scholar Andrew Lambert on the British Way of War and Julian Corbett. It's really a very, very good book, and he's great. Lambert's really great. A lot of good YouTube videos about Lambert, with Lambert talking about Corbett and some other topics of great interest, so highly recommend it. Corbett was at heart a naval historian, and he read a lot about naval history, and he carefully documented the naval history, the British naval history, from, well, I guess through the early modern period. And what he deduced was that there really was a British way of warfare. Rather, there's a kind of strategy that Britain most of the time had pursued, and with great success. And that basically this was the kind of thing that Britain should stick to, this formula for success that it's had for many, many centuries. Corbett stressed the idea of having a maritime strategy. And by this he means not a naval strategy. In fact, there's a distinction that he draws between maritime strategy and naval strategy, but maritime strategy was basically a way of talking about strategy, a grand strategy, perhaps we should call it, that reflected the reality that Britain was a maritime power. It was an island, it was protected by the seas, and its power, and it exercised its power mainly via what today we call the maritime domain. So that's why he talked about maritime strategy. Naval strategy was a separate thing. Naval strategy was something that needed to be subordinate to maritime strategy. Also, land strategy. Land strategy was something that needed to be subordinate to the grand strategy, this grand strategy, which he called maritime strategy. And part of the thing that's important for Corbett is this understanding that Britain, being a maritime power, therefore operated in a very different world and had different strengths and weaknesses from continental powers. He didn't think Britain should act like a continental power or think like a continental power, or most importantly, Britain should not try to seek to influence world affairs by getting involved in large land wars on the continent. Rather, Britain, as a maritime power, needed to focus on the seas. And on the seas, the primary objective was ultimately securing and protecting lines of communication on the seas, which is very different from controlling the seas, because it's kind of hard to control the seas, but it's about securing the lines of communication. Corbett also thought that because of Britain's maritime focus, what this did is it gave Britain the ability to expand or reduce the scale of war on its own terms, and to wield economic warfare, particularly through naval blockades, This, he thinks, is far more effective and far less expensive than pursuing victory on the ground. Corbett argued that most of the time what Britain did was try to secure the balance of power, rather ensure that the balance of power suited British interests. So this was different from dominating Europe or dominating the continent. It's more just sort of playing off the different sides to ensure, again, the balance of power. This is chiefly done through maritime power, but also sometimes he, of course, conceded Britain would land troops on the continent. However, the idea of landing troops on the continent was always just to pursue limited aims and have limited objectives, and ultimately was about supporting one ally against the other. But the primary tool was ultimately economic warfare. Likewise, Britain would use its wealth in order to subsidize certain allies. So you use economic warfare to impoverish your enemy while using your cash to support its allies, and occasionally landing troops, usually in support of some ally, to achieve a limited objective. Most of Britain's land operations, according to Corbett, were ultimately about controlling the Low Countries and the estuary of the River Scheldt. So the focus of British military activity was to keep an enemy out of the Low Countries. So for a while that was France, to keep France from dominating Belgium, or to keep the Germans from the Low Countries, to keep the Germans from dominating the Netherlands and Belgium. Why? Well, because this was essential for securing the English Channel and the North Atlantic. This was of vital strategic importance for Britain. The rest of the continent, really not so much. So Britain would focus on maritime power, on securing the Scheldt estuary, on securing the Low Countries, and occasionally using land troops here, there, and other places in order to effect some sort of shift in the balance of power, or basically to have some sort of effect that suited Britain's strategic objectives. One thing that Corbett was adamantly against was the idea of the sort of what he called the continentalist idea of trying to seek decision on the ground, on the land, on the European continent. So, for example, during the debates leading up to World War I about whether or not Britain should commit itself to defending France on the ground and placing a large British land force on France in the case of an invasion, Corbett thought that was really misguided. You don't do that. Don't commit yourself in an open-ended fashion to defending France from land. Part of the problem, he says, is that there was a misconception about how you actually win a war. The idea that you win a war through a decisive battle on land is something that he thought was wrong, and that what Britain really needed to do was pursue its objectives elsewhere. So, yes, use your forces to defend Belgium, right? To defend, rather, the coast of Belgium, the coast of the English Channel, and also certain key areas on the North Atlantic, but otherwise don't get involved. Thus, in the lead up to World War I, and then in the beginning of World War I, Corbett was opposed to sending the British Expeditionary Force to France, at least at the scale that Britain did. Far better to keep the troops and use them for amphibious operations here, there, and other places, and also to focus again on coastal operations on the littoral of the Low Countries. Corbett also believed that the real Achilles heel of Germany, and the way that you destroy Germany, is through its economy, and the fact that Germany still relied on imports, particularly from Scandinavia, of things like iron ore from Sweden, as well as for food. The best thing that he thought Britain could do in order to defeat Germany would be to weaken it through economic blockade, by preventing also Germany from importing anything from Scandinavia. And so the argument for Corbett was that the focus of British operations should be, again, the Low Countries, but then also the Baltic, securing access to the Baltic via Denmark, and also operating freely in the Baltic. Then Britain could use its expeditionary capabilities and its amphibious capabilities to do all sorts of terrible things to the Germans. But the idea is that ultimately this was a much better idea than having British divisions in France fighting alongside the French and trying to defeat Germany through a major decisive land battle. Now, key to Corbett's ideas is his reading of Clausewitz. And so from Corbett's point of view, Clausewitz's focus on decisive battle on land was, first of all, he says that's a misreading of Clausewitz, because he says that Clausewitz is much more nuanced than that. But then also he argued that Clausewitz ultimately was a Prussian officer writing for Prussians. Prussia was not landlocked, well, maybe, but Prussia was a land power, a continental power. And thus it operated in a strategic reality that was very different from Britain's. And so he didn't think that Britain should be reading Clausewitz that closely, at least taking from Clausewitz the kinds of lessons that it did, the lessons having to do with trying to seek decision in a decisive battle on land. Another thing that Corbett saw or insisted was in Clausewitz that he thought other people skipped was Clausewitz's distinctions between unlimited wars and limited wars. Now, to be fair, Corbett does say this, and he talks about Clausewitz at length in the book Some Principles of Maritime Strategy. He talks about how, at least in the beginning, in the first books of Clausewitz, it really is all about like big war, unlimited war, and absolute war. And only later in the book does he start writing about things like limited war and start to sort of acknowledge the fact that very often, wars are limited in nature. And if you have a limited war, that means that you're using limited means to achieve a limited end. And that's much more typical than the sort of the great all-out absolute wars that people seem to see in Clausewitz. For Britain, Corbett argued that made more sense, that Britain needed to view its land engagements in terms of limited wars. So use your economic means, use your maritime power, but to do the real work of weakening the enemy while using land operations in limited means to achieve limited ends, right? And so even in an unlimited war, for instance, Britain's war against Napoleonic France, ultimately what Britain did was a succession of limited campaigns to achieve limited objectives and limited ends. Britain never attempted to overthrow Napoleon through land invasion or on land. That's just not how it was going to work. And there are other countries that could do that, but for Britain, it was more about helping those other countries doing that, while also weakening Napoleon's ability to sustain himself and to sustain his empire. Now, a lot of what Corbett had to say, and a lot of Corbett's theories really ultimately revolve around also this idea of decision. The view that many people got from Clausewitz is this idea that you seek decision through decisive battle. That's how you win a war. Again, for Corbett, that's not where you seek decision. You seek decision elsewhere. Britain, or at least if you're Britain. For France, it made sense to seek decision on land. For Germany, it made sense to seek decision on land. For Britain, it really didn't. Meanwhile, what Britain could do to its adversary through economic warfare, that he argued was ultimately far more decisive than attempting a breakthrough on the Western Front, for example. If Corbett had been in charge of British forces in World War I, you would not have seen a large British war, a British component to the war on the Western Front. The British contribution to the Western Front would have been much smaller. Meanwhile, Britain would have focused on, again, using the littoral, attacking the littoral, trying to secure the coastline, and also doing everything possible to cut Germany off from any resources that it was importing from anybody, above all from Scandinavia. Let's fast forward to Basil Liddell Hart. Liddell Hart published in 1932 a book called The British Way of Warfare. What Hart did, so as we can see with Corbett, for Corbett, the British way of war was ultimately about strategy or even grand strategy. It's thinking about Britain as a maritime power and its use of sea power in order to achieve its security objectives. What Liddell Hart did, and he agreed with Corbett completely, but what he did was he tried to apply these basic ideas to the operational and even to the tactical level of war, using his review of history. So both Corbett and Hart are reviewing British military history, and they're looking at what worked and what didn't work. Hart agreed with Corbett that Britain was a maritime power, and that ultimately was the key to British power. And also that Britain's greatest weapon ultimately was probably economic warfare, its ability to wage economic warfare through blockade and by subsidizing allies. Hart also believed that mobility and surprise were key elements of British warfare, which is well suited for a country with naval dominance because Britain could land troops on any coast at any time as it chose. Also, it followed that expeditionary warfare was a major British strength. Hart also disdained the concept of trying to seek a decisive battle on land, and he wrote extensively in favor of what Hart called an indirect strategy or an indirect approach. Hart's concept of indirect strategy or indirect approach might be his most important contribution to military theory, although a lot of people have argued that it wasn't particularly original, but whatever. People read Hart and they got this idea, and this is also the part that both seems to have taken from Liddell Hart. Now, this boils down to the following points. First of all, you should avoid direct confrontation at all possible. Hart argued that direct attacks on firm defensive positions almost never work and should not be attempted. Instead, he advocated for advancing along the lines of least resistance. Never go straight at him, go around, get to the side, go to the rear, or go just someplace else. But just don't do the sort of frontal assault against defensive positions. That's just wasteful. Even if you achieve your objective, you're going to do it at an incredible cost. So come up with a different way of doing it. Secondly, Hart argued for psychological disruption. He said that the primary goal in battles to disrupt the enemy's equilibrium before engaging in the main attack. This involves targeting the balance or the stability of an enemy's force, of its control, of its morale, and also of its supply. He talked then in this context about surprise and maneuver. Hart emphasized the use of surprise and mobility to catch the enemy off guard, to exploit their weakness. This often involves threatening multiple objectives simultaneously to keep the enemy uncertain as to where you're going to direct your main effort. Hart also emphasized the geographical and psychological dimensions of warfare. The indirect approach has both the geographical aspect, you maneuver to strike at weak points, and then also a psychological aspect, a psychological dimension, which is that you use deception to create confusion and indecision. Hart also stressed the need for flexibility. He thought that armies have to be fluid and mobile, and that commanders need to be allowed to strike at the enemy's weakest points whenever opportunities arose. And then exploitation. After successfully dislocating the enemy, Hart stressed the importance of rapidly exploiting the situation before the enemy can recover its equilibrium. Hart developed this theory in response to World War I, where he just saw the British wasting thousands and thousands and thousands of people's lives and great expense in these frontal assaults against defended positions. He thought that this was absolute madness. Hart was convinced that if you did a survey of military history, he was convinced that what you see is that military operations, the most effective military operations, have employed indirect methods in order to ensure the enemy's lack of preparedness, rather than any kind of direct attack on anybody's prepared position. Corbett said there's a British way, and this British way there's a British way of warfare and associated with maritime strategy. Liddell Hart agreed, and he extended this to talk about how you need to, even on land, it's about the indirect approach, it's about going after the sides, it's about going after the weak points. But either way, both of them agreed that if you look at British military history, you see that there is indeed a British way of doing war. Now, there have been critics of Hart that have argued to the contrary. They haven't generally argued with Corbett, but they have argued with Hart. So among them, there's David French. David French in 1990 published a book called The British Way in Warfare, 1688 to 2000, in which he challenged several aspects of Liddell Hart's theses. First of all, French challenged the idea that there really even is a British way in warfare. And he says that there really is no single consistent British approach to warfare beyond adaptability. That's really it, just adaptability. And that adaptability was key. According to French, Britain's success in warfare was due to its ability to adapt to changing circumstances rather than adhere to any fixed strategy. French also argued that he saw varied approaches throughout British military history. So some wars fit Liddell Hart's paradigm of a indirect approach and a maritime focus. Other wars involved different strategies, including the deployment of mass armies on the continent. French also argued that when you look at how policy was made, what you see is the influence of competing interests, that British strategy often reflected the competing interests of different groups with different contrasting goals, rather than there being any kind of overall consistent way of warfare. He also said that muddle was really Britain's key strategy. French suggested that if there's a true British way of warfare, it could be characterized as muddling, a flexible and adaptive approach that proved successful over time. Another important critique of Hart comes from the military historian Hew Strachan. Strachan in 1983 published an article entitled The British Way of Warfare Revisited, or rather, The British Way in Warfare Revisited, which examines the concept of whether or not there really is a distinctive British approach to war and strategy and its implications for British defense policy. Like French, Strachan challenges the idea that there really ever was a consistent British approach to warfare, arguing that British strategies have been more adaptable and varied than proponents of a British way have admitted or have acknowledged. He also, of course, criticized Hart's work, his 1932 work, as more brilliant political pamphleteering rather than a serious work of academic scholarship. Strachan argues that Liddell Hart selectively used historical examples to support his preferred strategic approach. A more balanced approach, according to Strachan, leads to much more balanced conclusions. And then in addressing the tensions, historical tensions between a maritime-focused strategy and a continental-focused strategy in British military history, Strachan notes that Britain often has been more involved in continental warfare than the British way narrative suggests. So it's not that much. It's not the exception that proves the rule that Britain gets involved in large land wars on the continent. Rather, it happened quite a bit, so much so that it's hard to argue that it's exceptional. Now, stepping back a little bit, we see that these critiques spark, I would say they lead to a wider debate about British strategy and also the extent to which there is such a thing as a British way of war. One thing has to do with continuity and change. Is there really a consistent British way, or has British strategy been more adaptive and varied? Maybe from one war to another, British strategy has simply evolved. There's no common denominator. This is interesting. I mean, it also, this reminds me about, this parallels the debates about whether or not there's an American way of warfare. And I did make a video about that, and I put a link to the description on that. In my video about the American way of war, I argued that there are many who said that there really is no such thing, because most of the time American commanders found themselves improvising and adapting according to the immediate circumstances that they found themselves in, rather than applying any kind of cultural style or national strategy or national approach to strategy, etc. There's also the question of maritime versus continental. So how do we reconcile Britain's naval traditions with its repeated continental commitments? Some argue, those who favor a British way of war, the quote-unquote British way of war, would stress that ultimately the maritime domain is where Britain should continue to focus, because that's the way it's always been. Others say, well, no, that's not really how it's always been, and there's really no need or no call to rule out a continental approach based on precedent, because the reality is that you can find precedents for both. There's also this business about a limited war versus a total war, and whether or not there's an open question about whether or not the concept of limited war really is more representative of British military history than otherwise. Now, in terms of contemporary implications, I think it should be fairly obvious that readers of Corbett and Liddell Hart can easily identify lessons for today as the United Kingdom struggles to update its defense policy and to make difficult choices about where to invest its money. For people who think in terms of the kind of Corbett and Liddell Hart's idea of there being a British way of warfare, it's pretty easy to argue in favor of focusing investment on the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force, and not being too concerned with the British Army, and also, perhaps more importantly, not being concerned that the British Army may or may not have the ability to generate, deploy, and sustain large ground forces to the continent. The argument is, well, Britain doesn't need it. It hasn't really worked very well for Britain in the past. This is not the British way, so don't worry about it. Plus, these days, it's also easy to argue, if you're thinking about Russia, that there are plenty of other countries that can do it. So just as Corbett would argue that you should let France fight the Germans on the ground, it's easy today to argue that you can let the Germans and the Poles and others who've got large land forces, let them worry about the Russians. Meanwhile, Britain can do its thing, sticking to the ocean and sticking to the littoral areas. In light of the criticism of Hart, however, one can argue that maybe one should be more cautious about making many sweeping judgments about what is or is not good for Britain. If adaptability really is the one and only one hallmark of British strategy over time, then the UK should probably be more focused on its ability to adapt to whatever situation emerges. That might, for example, mean having to land a large ground force to operate on the continent or anywhere else. So, therefore, perhaps the UK needs to ensure that it has the ability to do so. So it's less about, no, we should have a continental focus, or no, the UK should have a massive, massive army the way it used to during the Cold War, the British Army on the Rhine, but rather it needs to be large enough to still be deployable if you find that that's what's necessary. Now, this argument does remind me of the argument that my friend Nick Drummond made in the previous video, and a video that I did as a conversation with Nick Drummond about land warfare, in which he was saying, like, yeah, of course, you need to spend more money on the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force for no other reason than the fact that this stuff's so expensive that, like, each ship nowadays cost at least £1 billion apiece. So therefore, the lion's share of the money is going to go to the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force. And of course, that's just the way it's got to be. However, Drummond was concerned about the Army being too neglected. So it's one thing to say that the focus should be on the Navy and the Air Force and not the Army, but it's another thing to say that you can use the Army as just a source of revenue by cutting the Army until it's a negligible entity, because you want to throw all the money at the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force. For Drummond, it's imperative to respect the idea that at a certain point the Army becomes too small to be of any use. It has to be larger than that minimal point. So he argues right now that the British Army is simply too small. It needs to be bigger. Not big enough so that it could fight, major divisions on the continent, but big enough so that it could at least deploy and sustain a division. So at least has the option. So at least it can do things and it can adapt to whatever circumstances might transpire. I personally tend to favor much more of a Corbettian, if that's the adjective, approach, because I've gone on record as saying that no, Britain should kind of stick to the quote-unquote the British way, which would be focusing on naval operations and focusing on helping its allies. So let the Poles and the Germans and the others fight the Russians. Meanwhile, do everything possible to seal off the Baltic Sea and to protect Scandinavia by in the water, and use other interventions, sometimes ground interventions, sometimes not. But it's more about nudging here and there in support of an ally, while also using economic means, using economic warfare and throwing money at allies to kind of keep them in the fight. You could argue that what Britain has been doing for Ukraine is actually very consistent with this. British troops are not on the ground, but Britain has been funneling money and providing weapons to Ukraine to help Ukraine stay in the fight. So it's an extension of this. You limit the actual engagement on the continent, but while using the military in order to support the war that's going on in the continent, but through other means. So you don't fight the Russians directly, but you do things to shut down Kaliningrad, or just, you control the Baltic, you control imports and exports, and you can do this in the Indo-Pacific. It's about sanctions evasion. Those are the things that lend themselves naturally to British power. As for how big the British Army should be, I mean, again, I think that here Drummond's words of caution are pertinent. The idea that at a certain level the army is just too small, and it needs to be large enough at a certain level in order to be able to do certain things in case you find that that's necessary. Now, that's very different from saying, yeah, absolutely, Britain should deploy large ground forces and therefore should have the forces capable of doing that. No, it's not about the should or the will or planning to or committing to anything. It's simply about having capability in case of an emergency, with the emphasis being on the need for adaptability and the realization that we really have no idea what's going to happen next and what kind of conflicts are going to break out on the European continent or really any place else. If you found this video at all enjoyable, please like and subscribe, and feel free to, if you have any thoughts, please add to the comment section below. Also, if you look in the links in the description, the description, I'll put links to the books that I mentioned and Corbett's work, as well as Hart's work and Strachan and David French. And I've also checked out my Substack, also called Pax Americana, and I put links to my accounts on Twitter, Blue Sky, and LinkedIn. Thank you very much, and stay tuned. There's much more in the pipeline. Thank you. Bye-bye.